My name is Clara Elizabeth Vance, and I was born on a humid Tuesday in July of 1848, in the rolling hills of Virginia. I am nearly 90 years old now, and the world I see outside my window bears no resemblance to the one that shaped me. They say that with age comes the softening of memories, but for me the past remains as sharp as a winter frost. I have carried a secret for 70 years, a weight that has pressed against my ribs since I was a girl of 19. It has outlived my husband, my children, and the very house where the silence began. To look at me now is to see a grandmother who spent her life in service to her family and her faith, but beneath this lace collar is a truth that would have burned my life to ashes had I spoken it. My childhood was one of duty and quiet expectations. My father was a man of the earth, a tobacco farmer whose hands were permanently stained the color of the soil he worked. He was not a man of many words, but his silence was never empty. It was filled with the steady rhythm of a life governed by the seasons. My mother was his perfect counterpart, a woman who could stretch a single loaf of bread to feed a table of 8, and who believed that a clean apron was the highest mark of a woman's character. I was the second of 5 children, and from the moment I could reach the table I was taught that my life did not belong to me. It belonged to the farm, to the hearth, and eventually to the man who would take me from them. We lived by the sun rising before it to stoke the fires and collapsing long after it set. There was a comfort in that repetition, a sense that as long as the chores were done the world would remain in its proper place. But the world did not stay in its place. The shadows of the great conflict began to stretch across our valley, and the peace of my girlhood was swallowed by a darkness that no one saw coming. I remember the smell of the air changing as if the very wind carried the scent of wood smoke and iron. It was during those years of upheaval that I first learned how easily a life can be fractured, and how a single choice made in the desperation of youth can echo through 7 decades of silence. I have waited until the end to speak because there is no one left to hurt, and because a secret that long kept becomes a ghost that refuses to leave until its story is told. By the time I reached my 17th year, the world around our Virginia farm had been hollowed out by the war. The men were gone, the horses were taken, and the laughter that once filled our kitchen had been replaced by a thin, brittle silence. It was in this atmosphere of scarcity and fear that I first met Julian. He was not from our valley. He was a stranger who appeared at our gate one evening, his clothes tattered and his eyes reflecting a weariness that went far beyond his 20 years. My father, despite his own hardships, could not turn away a soul in need, and so Julian stayed. He worked our fields in exchange for a place in the barn and a share of our meager meals. At first, he was merely a shadow in the periphery of my life, but as the weeks turned into months, the space between us began to shrink. We found ourselves alone in the quiet moments of the dusk, leaning against the fence as the fireflies began their nightly dance. Julian spoke of a life before the smoke, of a library in Richmond where he had spent his days surrounded by the scent of old paper, and the promise of a future that now seemed like a dream. He was the first person who ever looked at me and saw something more than a pair of hands meant for churning butter and mending socks. He saw a mind that hungered for more than the cycle of the seasons. Our love was not a sudden burst of flame, but a slow, steady warmth that grew in the hidden corners of our shared days. We spoke in hushed tones behind the woodpile and exchanged glances across the dinner table that felt like a language all their own. For the first time in my life, I began to imagine a world that existed beyond the boundaries of my father's land. Julian promised me that when the chaos finally subsided, He would take me away to a place where we could build a life based on choice rather than necessity. He spoke of cities with paved streets and gas lights, of theaters and music that could make the heart ache with its beauty. I clung to those promises like a drowning woman to an oar, but as our bond deepened, so did the danger. My father had already chosen a path for me, a marriage to a neighbor's son, a man named Silas who was as sturdy and unyielding as the oak trees on his property. To my father, Silas represented security and the preservation of the land. To me, he represented a life sentence of quiet desperation. Julian and I knew we could not wait for the world to right itself. We began to make plans in the dark of night, whispering of a departure that would have to be swift and final. I started secreting away small things: a silver thimble, a heavy woolen shawl, a few coins I had saved from selling eggs. We were young and fueled by a desperate kind of hope that blinded us to the reality of the risks we were taking. The air in our house felt heavy, charged with the electricity of my unspoken rebellion. Every time my mother looked at me with her tired, knowing eyes, I felt a pang of guilt that nearly choked me. But the pull of Julian and the life he offered was stronger than the tether of my upbringing. We set a date for our flight, a moonless night in late October when the frost would muffle our footsteps. I thought I was prepared for everything, but I did not understand then that the heart can be a treacherous thing, and that the secrets we keep from those we love are the ones that eventually consume us. I was standing on the precipice of a new life, unaware that the ground beneath me was already beginning to crumble. The weeks leading up to our planned departure were the most agonizing of my life. Every time I sat at the dinner table, the clinking of silverware against ceramics sounded like a funeral knell. I looked at my younger sisters, their faces still round with the innocence of childhood, and felt a crushing guilt that I was about to abandon them to a life of labor while I chased a dream of gaslights and velvet. My father had begun to speak more frequently of the wedding with Silas, mentioning the repairs he intended to make to the small cottage on the edge of our property where he expected us to live. He spoke with a sense of relief, as if my marriage was the final piece of a puzzle that would ensure the family's survival in a world that had become so uncertain. Each word he spoke felt like a stone being placed upon my chest. I wanted to scream, to tell him that I was not a piece of livestock to be traded for the security of the fence line, but the weight of my secret kept me silent. Julian and I became masters of the unspoken. We developed a system of signals. A certain way a lantern was placed in the window, a specific whistle used to call the hounds, that told us when it was safe to meet in the shadows of the orchard. It was there, beneath the skeletal branches of the apple trees, that we refined our plan. We would leave on a Friday, the night my father usually traveled to the next county to trade tobacco. Julian had managed to secure 2 horses from a traveler passing through. Hidden now in a ravine 3 miles to the west, we would ride through the night, bypass the main checkpoints, and make for the rail line that could take us north toward the coastal cities. Julian spoke of the future with such conviction that I could almost see the city skyline, almost feel the weight of a different kind of life. However, as the date approached, a heavy, suffocating dread began to settle over me. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was the realization that I was about to erase the girl I had been. I spent my final days touching the familiar things of my home with a reverence I had never felt before. The rough grain of the wooden banister, the cool surface of the milk cellar stones, the faded embroidery of my mother's favorite chair. One evening, my mother found me standing in the kitchen, staring at the hearth. She came up behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch light but heavy with unspoken understanding. She told me that a woman's life is often built on the things she chooses to leave behind. I wondered then if she knew, if she could see the betrayal written in the tension of my shoulders. But she said nothing more, only squeezed my arm and went back to her mending. The night before we were to leave, a storm rolled in from the mountains. It wasn't a violent storm, but a persistent, chilling rain that turned the dirt roads into ribbons of thick, black mud. Julian met me by the well, his face pale in the flickering lightning. He whispered that the weather would work in our favor, that no one would be out on the roads to see two riders fleeing in the dark. We pressed our foreheads together, the rain soaking into our hair, and I felt a desperate, terrifying love for him that surpassed my fear of the unknown. We agreed to meet at the edge of the woods at midnight. I went back inside, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I thought it would wake the house. I packed my small bundle, my hands shaking so violently I could hardly tie the knots. I lay in bed, fully dressed under my nightgown, watching the shadows of the rain race across the ceiling. The clock in the hallway ticked with a deafening rhythm, counting down the minutes until I would step out of that house and into a story I could never take back. I didn't know then that the rain was a warning, or that by dawn, the secret I had been protecting would turn into a tragedy that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The midnight hour arrived with a silence so profound it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. I slipped out of my window, the wet grass clutching at my hem as I sprinted toward the treeline. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. I found Julian waiting by the old stone marker, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the gray mist. He didn't speak. He simply took my hand, his grip cold and trembling, and led me toward the ravine where the horses were hidden. We reached the animals, their breath blooming like white ghosts in the dark. As I climbed into the saddle, a sense of finality washed over me. I was leaving Clara Elizabeth Vance behind in that farmhouse, buried under the quilts of a bed that would be empty by morning. We rode through the mud, the rhythmic thud of hooves the only sound in the desolate landscape. We had bypassed the main road, taking a narrow logging trail that cut through the densest part of the woods. Julian was ahead of me, his back straight, looking toward the horizon as if he could already see our freedom. But as we neared the crossing at Miller's Creek, the sound of the rushing water was joined by something else, the sharp, rhythmic snapping of branches. My blood turned to ice. From the thicket to our right, 3 figures emerged on horseback, their lanterns swinging like predatory eyes. It was Silas, my father's choice for my husband, along with 2 of his brothers. They had not been sleeping, they had been watching. The confrontation was instantaneous and violent. Silas screamed my name, a sound full of wounded pride and possessive rage. Julian tried to wheel his horse around to shield me, shouting for me to run, to keep going toward the rail line. But the mud was a traitor. His horse lost its footing, sliding into the rain-swollen bank of the creek. In the chaos of shouting and the rearing of frightened animals, a shot rang out, a sharp, dry crack that seemed to shatter the very air. I watched in frozen horror as Julian slumped forward, his hands losing their grip on the reins. He didn't scream. He simply drifted into the dark water of the creek, the current claiming him before I could even utter his name. I was dragged from my horse by Silas, his fingers bruising my arms, his face a mask of disgusted triumph. He didn't kill me. He did something far worse. He and his brothers took me back to my father's house in the gray light of dawn. My father was waiting on the porch, His face aged 10 years in a single night. There was no shouting, no weeping. There was only a cold, methodical erasure of what had happened. My father looked at the mud on my skirts and the hollow look in my eyes and told me that Julian was a drifter who had moved on in the night. He told me that if a single word of this escape or the skirmish at the creek ever left my lips, he would disown me and leave my younger sisters to starve. He made me a prisoner of my own life. 2 weeks later, with the smell of the creek water still haunting my senses, I was married to Silas in the parlor of that very house. I stood there in a white dress that felt like a shroud, promising to honor a man I loathed, while the only man I ever loved lay at the bottom of a nameless bank, forgotten by everyone but the girl who had killed him with her hope. Silas is gone now. He died in the winter of 1904, taking his cold temper and his heavy silences to a grave I rarely visit. My father followed him a few years later, and then my mother, and eventually the sisters I had once hoped to protect. I am the last one left in this theater of ghosts. I spent 40 years as the wife of a man who knew I was a captive, and yet he never once spoke of that night at the creek. We lived a life of prosperous, hollow respectability. We had 4 children who grew up, moved to the cities Julian once described, and gave me grandchildren who look at my faded photographs and see only a pioneer woman who survived the hard years of the 19th century. They do not see the girl who died in the mud of Miller's Creek. They do not know that every time I looked at the rain, I was searching for a body that was never found, or that every time I sat in church, I was screaming inside at the hypocrisy of the vows I had been forced to take. I have kept this secret for 70 years because the world I was born into demanded it. In 1867, a woman who fled with a drifter was a ruin. A woman whose lover was killed by her suitor was a scandal that would have ended my family's standing and seen my father imprisoned. I chose the silence to keep the peace, but the peace has been a heavy shroud. For 7 decades, I have walked through this life as a stranger to myself. I have been a good mother, a dutiful wife, and a pillar of this community, but it was all a performance played out on a stage of grief. I often wonder who I would have been if the mud hadn't been so slick, or if Silas hadn't been so vigilant. Would I have been happy in those cities with the gaslights? Or would Julian and I have found that the world is just as cruel in the bright lights as it is in the shadows of a Virginia farm? I am 90 years old now, and the doctor says my heart is finally tired of beating. I find that I am not afraid. For the first time in my long life, I feel a sense of lightness. I have written this down not for my children to find while I am alive, but for the truth to exist somewhere outside of my own mind. I want it known that Clara Elizabeth Vance did not just live a life of chores and duty. I want it known that I loved a man named Julian with a ferocity that the years could not dim, and that I carried his memory like a hidden flame through the coldest winters of my existence. The secret is no longer a weight. It is a bridge. Soon I will close my eyes and I will not see the white lace of my funeral dress or the faces of my grieving family. I will see the orchard in the dusk. I will hear the whistle of a man by the well. I will walk down to the edge of the creek where the water is clear and the mud is gone. And I will finally, after 70 years of waiting, let go of the reins.